At 107 degrees, concrete becomes dangerous to touch. At 15 below zero, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Between these extremes, thousands of black women have survived on American streets, many of them for years or even decades. They developed techniques that social workers dismissed and police confiscated. These methods involve cardboard architecture, strategic newspaper placement, and a precise understanding of how the human body loses heat. These were not random survival hacks. They were refined systems passed between women who couldn't afford to get it wrong. The knowledge saved lives. It also stayed hidden, shared only among those who needed it most, invisible to everyone else. The shelter system in most American cities operated on a simple assumption: homeless people needed roofs over their heads. What they actually needed was temperature management. Those were different problems entirely. The black women surviving Chicago's streets in the 1980s understood this distinction with a precision that would impress thermal engineers. They had developed techniques for staying cool in brutal summers and warm in deadly winters, methods refined over decades and passed quietly between women who knew that official help was not coming. These techniques worked. They also kept getting confiscated by authorities who saw them as problems rather than solutions. The knowledge persisted anyway, spreading through networks that operated below the radar of social services, housing agencies, and everyone else who thought they knew what homeless people needed. The women who gathered beneath the Eisenhower Expressway overpass in Chicago during the summer of 1987 had been surviving on the streets for anywhere from 6 months to 23 years. They were not a formal group. People came and went, circumstances changed, some found housing and some died, but a core of about 15 black women maintained a loose community that shared resources, information, and protection. The oldest among them was a woman everyone called Miss Lorraine, though whether that was her real name or a street name, nobody asked. Miss Lorraine had been homeless since 1964. She had survived 23 Chicago winters without losing fingers or toes to frostbite, and 23 Chicago summers without heat stroke. In a population where the average life expectancy was around 50 years, Miss Lorraine was 61 and still teaching younger women how to make it through another season. The conventional wisdom about surviving extreme temperatures on the street was almost entirely wrong, and Miss Lorraine knew it. Shelters told people to drink water in summer and find warmth in winter, advice so general it was nearly useless. The Red Cross distributed emergency blankets that crinkled loudly and attracted attention. Social workers handed out pamphlets about frostbite prevention that assumed people had access to dry clothing and warm spaces. None of this addressed the actual physics of survival. Miss Lorraine had learned those physics through trial and brutal error, watching people die from approaches that should have worked and survival from methods that seemed counterintuitive. The fundamental problem, she explained to a younger woman named Denise one sweltering July afternoon, was that people thought about temperature wrong. They focused on air temperature when they should focus on heat transfer. Your body does not care what the thermometer says. It cares about how fast it is gaining or losing heat. And that depends on what you are touching, what you are wet with, what is moving air across your skin, and what is radiating heat toward you or away from you. Get those 4 things right, and you can be comfortable at temperatures that kill people who get them wrong. Denise had been on the streets for 8 months after losing her job, and then her apartment in quick succession. She had spent her first winter in warming centers and emergency shelters, miserable and constantly sick. Her first summer had been worse because the shelters closed during warm months, and she had nearly collapsed from heat exhaustion twice in June alone. She was 34 years old, had worked as a nursing assistant for 12 years before everything fell apart, and had just enough medical knowledge to recognize that Miss Lorraine was describing principles of thermoregulation that matched what she had learned in training. Conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation. Those are the 4 mechanisms of heat transfer. Miss Lorraine had never taken a physiology class, but she understood these principles more thoroughly than most nurses Denise had worked with. The other women in the community contributed their own knowledge. A woman named Georgia, who had spent time in Arizona before ending up in Chicago, knew techniques for desert heat that translated to urban summers. Another woman called Big Sandra had worked in a commercial laundry for 15 years and understood how different fabrics held or released heat. A younger woman named Keisha had been a home health aide and knew which medical conditions made temperature regulation harder: diabetes, heart problems, and certain medications. Together, they had assembled a body of knowledge that addressed survival from multiple angles. Miss Lorraine laid out the core principle that governed everything else. You had to stop fighting the environment and start managing your relationship with it. In summer, that meant accepting that you could not stay cool through willpower. You had to reduce heat gain from outside sources and maximize heat loss from your body. In winter, you had to minimize heat loss in the right order of priority: ground contact first, then wind exposure, then trapped air, then moisture management. Get the priorities backwards and you would freeze with a perfectly good blanket because you were lying directly on cold concrete. The summer techniques Miss Lorraine taught seemed strange until you understood the physics behind them. The most important one involves shade, not just finding it, but creating it in layers. A single layer of shade, like sitting under an awning, helped, but not enough. The awning itself absorbed heat and radiated it downward. What you needed was multiple layers with air gaps between them. Miss Lorraine showed Denise how to rig a cardboard sheet about 2 feet above her sleeping spot, creating an air gap between the overhead cover and the cardboard. The upper layer absorbed the radiant heat. The air gap prevented that heat from conducting downward, and the cardboard provided a second barrier. The temperature difference in that shaded space could be 15 to 20 degrees cooler than single-layer shade. Water worked differently than most people assumed. The instinct was to pour water on yourself to cool down, but on humid Chicago days, that water just sat on your skin without evaporating, making you feel worse. Miss Lorraine taught selective wetting, dampening specific spots where blood vessels ran close to the surface: the wrists, the neck, the inside of the elbows and knees, and the temples. Small amounts of water on those spots evaporated efficiently and cooled the blood passing underneath, which then circulated through the body. Pouring water over your whole body wasted water and provided less cooling than strategic placement. Clothing choices mattered enormously, and the conventional advice was almost backwards. People assumed light colors and loose clothing were always better in heat. Miss Lorraine knew it was more complicated. Light, loose clothing worked well in dry heat with direct sun. But in humid conditions with mixed sun and shade, darker clothing that absorbed more heat could actually create stronger convection currents, pulling air across the skin. She had experimented for years, learning which combinations worked for which conditions. The winter techniques were even more refined, and this was where the confiscation problem became serious. Cardboard was the foundation of winter survival on the street, and Miss Lorraine had developed cardboard construction into something approaching engineering. She taught Denise that cardboard's insulating value came from its corrugated structure. The wavy interior trapped air in small pockets. Orientation mattered. Cardboard laid flat under you compressed those air pockets and lost insulating value. Cardboard placed in layers with small gaps between them, propped up on crushed cans or folded cardboard strips, maintained the air structure and insulated far better. The ground was where you lost the most heat, far more than to cold air. Miss Lorraine insisted on at least 4 inches of insulation between the body and the ground. Multiple layers of cardboard, newspaper, and whatever fabric was available made that thickness. Sleeping directly on concrete in winter was equivalent to lying on a block of ice. The concrete conducted heat away from the body faster than the body could produce it. Women died every winter from hypothermia because they had neglected ground insulation. Newspaper had specific applications. Crumpled newspaper, stuffed inside clothing, created air pockets that insulated almost as well as commercial down. It had to be loosely crumpled, not wadded tight. It also had to stay dry. Wet newspaper conducted heat rather than insulating it. Miss Lorraine showed Denise how to create a moisture barrier by wrapping plastic bags around her torso under the newspaper layer. The plastic trapped body moisture, keeping the newspaper insulation dry. These setups took time to construct properly, and that was where the authorities became a problem. City workers cleared homeless encampments regularly, confiscating cardboard structures, bedding, and supplies. They called it cleanup or public safety. What it actually meant was destroying survival infrastructure that took days to rebuild. A well-constructed sleeping setup could maintain body temperature through a 20-degree night. Losing that setup meant starting over with whatever materials could be scavenged. Some women died in that gap between confiscation and reconstruction. The first real test of what Denise learned came during the brutal winter of 1988, when Chicago saw temperatures drop to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The city opened emergency warming centers, but they were overwhelmed within hours. Shelters turned away hundreds of people. The mayor went on television asking residents to check on elderly neighbors. Nobody mentioned the homeless population directly. Denise had spent 2 weeks before the cold snap gathering materials and building her winter setup according to Miss Lorraine's specifications. She had 6 layers of cardboard beneath her, arranged with air gaps. A windbreak of cardboard and plastic sheeting protected 3 sides. Newspaper insulation was placed inside her clothing and replaced daily to prevent moisture buildup. A plastic vapor barrier sat against her skin. Multiple blankets were layered with newspaper between them. The whole construction looked like a pile of trash to anyone passing by. It was actually a carefully engineered shelter that maintained a survivable microclimate. She spent that night in her setup while the temperature dropped to minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, her water bottle had frozen solid, but she was alive and had all her fingers and toes. At the hospital 6 blocks away, emergency rooms treated 47 cases of severe frostbite that night, and 3 homeless people were found dead from exposure within a mile of Denise's overpass. The difference was not luck, it was knowledge that had taken Miss Lorraine 20 years to accumulate, and that she passed to Denise in a few months of patient teaching. The techniques spread through networks that social services never saw. Women leaving Chicago carried the knowledge to Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Gary. Women arriving brought techniques from other cities, a method for managing sweat in New York humidity, a cardboard construction style from Philadelphia, and a moisture barrier approach developed in Minneapolis. The knowledge cross-pollinated, improving and adapting. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody published guides. It moved through oral tradition, taught by women who had survived, to women who needed it. Modern emergency management has slowly rediscovered some of these principles. FEMA guidance now emphasizes ground insulation. Disaster preparedness materials acknowledge the importance of vapor barriers. But the comprehensive, integrated understanding that women like Miss Lorraine developed remains largely outside official knowledge systems. It exists in communities that professionals do not consult, held by people whose expertise is not recognized because it was not learned in classrooms. The class and race dynamics kept this knowledge marginalized. Survival techniques developed by Black homeless women did not fit into professional credentialing systems. There were no certificates, no training programs, no official recognition. Social workers with master's degrees distributed pamphlets written by people who had never spent a night on the street. Emergency management plans were developed without consulting the populations who had actually survived emergencies repeatedly. The expertise was invisible because the people holding it were invisible. Miss Lorraine died in 1994 at age 68, having survived 30 years on Chicago's streets. She had outlived most people who had entered homelessness when she did. She had taught dozens of women techniques that kept them alive through conditions that killed others. Her knowledge persisted in those women and the women they taught, spreading through cities across the Midwest and beyond. None of it was ever officially documented. None of it earned recognition from agencies that spent millions studying homelessness. It remained underground, passed quietly, surviving because the women who held it survived. The fundamental insight Miss Lorraine taught was not about cardboard or newspaper or any specific technique. It was about understanding that survival required working with physical reality rather than against it. The human body operates according to thermodynamic principles that do not care about poverty or housing status. Master those principles. Understand how heat moves, how moisture affects insulation, how ground contact drains warmth, and you can survive conditions that seem impossible. Ignore them, and no amount of willpower or good intentions will keep you alive. The women who gathered beneath that overpass understood this. They learned it because they had to. They taught it because nobody else would. And the knowledge remains, spreading still, saving lives in ways that official systems never see and rarely acknowledge.